Hi, I'm Christine. Welcome back to my channel. After several back-to-back videos of me praising the handling of Matt Murdock's heightened senses on Daredevil Born Again, we get to the otherwise excellent episode 7, only for something to happen that I never even thought I'd have to worry about. I was looking forward to a scene that seemed destined to highlight Matt's blindness in interesting ways. I mean, we're talking about artwork here, people. Artwork!
You don't need sight to appreciate art, but you do need honesty.
Sight helps.
For the handful of people in the Daredevil fandom who reached out to check whether I'd had a stroke after watching the scene or whether I was still breathing, thank you. But I'm fine, I promise. But yes, I was pretty stunned. However, the question posed in the thumbnail to this video, ball drop or food for thought, isn't just disingenuous clickbait. As a matter of fact, and as an optimist at heart, I view this as an opportunity to talk about some of the key concepts that I think are central to the understanding of this character. When the universe gives you ball drops, turn them into educational YouTube content. And while this is a longer video where we take an instructive detour via various Daredevil media, I hope to make it worth your while. And the common theme tying this whole video together is that propensity for Daredevil creators to yearn for some connection to something image-like, something that's still a bit too much like sight. Before we get to that, I still want to be open to the idea that we're all collectively misunderstanding what's happening in this scene. In order to dig into some alternative theories, let's look at the scene in question.
Hey!
Some of the rationalizations that me and my friends in the fandom have concocted include, 1, he's actually hearing Officer Powell after the fact when he's talking to Fisk, although unfortunately Matt seems to have left by that point, so maybe that's not a particularly strong theory. Or 2, that Matt is tipped off by the conversation of the cops that he must have been listening to off screen before they leave, where they maybe mention something that only congeals in his mind as he's searching for something, anything in these paintings, and it only comes together as he realizes his hand made the same movement as it had that morning with Heather. Or 3, that Matt is sensing the probably raised letters of Heather's book title, which does look like it's got a pretty fancy dust jacket, when his hand appears to go back a step off screen just before Officer Powell appears. The reason I hold out some hope here is that the scene is fundamentally unclear. It's the flashback scene, really, that cements the idea of recognition. But when they cut back to the shot of Matt, there's no obvious sign of it beyond that at that moment. And he seems pretty frustrated by the whole process until something clicks. And then the "Oh Christ" also comes a beat or two later, also shortly before Officer Powell shows up. Could this all be unfortunate editing? Is there a scene missing? Was this meant to go a different way and then they threw this together at the last minute? An unfortunate casualty of stitching together their pre- and post-overhaul visions of this episode? Who knows? To quote my frequent Talk Daredevil podcast co-host, the inimitable Shelby, and I'll read, "We also don't know how long he was just lurking around beforehand. Maybe he knew they were trying to ID shit, so that's why he bounces down and is like, oh, let me see, finger this shit. Let me put my touch DNA all over it. Then oh yeah, I'm of no goddamn use here. Flashback to the morning, like what the fuck am I doing? Fingering evidence when I was just fingering softness and love and goodness, and then, oh fuck, my boyfriend's back. Let me knock his ass out and grab some art and go." Takes him to Cherry and bam, 2 birds. He knows and the cops know at most at the same time, but I'm going to frame the flashback as more of an MM jolt in the middle of DD. Thank you, Shelby, for that lovely description. That's going to be my headcanon now. I also want to be open to the idea that the people involved actually meant to use this scene as a way to highlight Matt's blindness or even elevate his often ignored sense of touch. That I can absolutely respect, even though I find it very unfortunate that they went this route. And so, if we are to actually read this as Matt recognizing Heather's face from a painting, this is absolutely one of the most obviously bonkers scenes in the history of live action Daredevil. And I say obviously bonkers because even if we're supposed to understand this as presented, there have been other scenes, even quite a few of them from the previous show, that make about as little sense as this one does. However, they tend to be of the kind where you actually have to be fairly science savvy or spend some time thinking about the situation to realize what the problem is, which is what makes them less obviously strange. What these scenes tend to have in common is an issue that I've taken to calling a stimulus problem. In the context of sensation and perception, the presence of a stimulus is central. The stimulus is that aspect of the real world, whether we're talking about matter or energy, that can be detected by our sense organs. A stimulus can be chemicals, which are detected through smell and taste. It could be physical pressure, like mechanical energy that's applied through touch, or in the case of vibration, through either hearing, touch, or both. Our sense of hot and cold responds to the net flow of heat in the skin. Seeing depends on the eye being sensitive to photons in the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum that are reflected by objects in the presence of a light source, and so on. How these stimuli behave and what they can reveal about the world is subject to slightly different sets of rules depending on the physics of the particular stimulus. And how we experience them is further subject to certain contingencies or predictable interactions between these stimuli and our sense organs and bodies. For instance, if we're moving closer to a sound source, we experience the sound as becoming louder. If we move closer to an object that we are seeing, the object appears larger because it falls on a larger portion of the retina than if we are farther away. One key aspect of how we experience vision as moving through a world that can be observed is visual flow. As we move, these observed objects move across our field of vision, coming closer or moving off screen to the side as we pass them. The sensation of touch, on the other hand, is intimately connected with the body itself and the skin as sort of a receptive surface. We experience touch as happening where it's actually happening. Now, a stimulus problem, as I define it, arises when Daredevil does something where it's either one, unclear what the stimulus is, where Matt seems to just know something in ways that are unclear to the viewer or reader and doesn't seem immediately obvious from how his senses are supposed to work. Or two, when the stimulus suggested behaves strangely. This could be something like scent molecules being asked to behave like photons of light, such as in this panel from the comics, and do check the post associated with this video for the full breakdown on what's wrong with this scene. Or three, when the natural relationship between a stimulus and its corresponding sense organ is lost. This also comes into play in the panel I just mentioned, since even if scent molecules could behave like sight, the nose doesn't have the ability to create a detailed spatial map from this information. That's not how noses work, whether you have a heightened sense of smell or not. This exact situation also reminds me of a scene from the 2003 Daredevil movie where scents are presented to the viewer and presumably to Matt, played by Ben Affleck in this case, as visual objects, as if smoke bouncing off of or brushing past faces could provide Matt with detailed spatial information somehow, beyond getting a basic idea of where the smell itself is coming from. There's just no way this could work, and it has nothing to do with heightened senses per se. What's at play here is a misunderstanding of how these stimuli work and what their interactions with the body look like. Hence, a stimulus problem. It's the same thing with this brief clip from episode 7, Stick, from the first season of the original show.
Her skin's too hot.
So here we have a scene of Matt remote sensing the temperature of a woman's skin that rests on both a misunderstanding of thermosensation and optics. Because the way we sense hot and cold has nothing to do with how infrared cameras work, which is what you would be led to believe. So-called night vision works by shifting the otherwise invisible light that typically corresponds with the temperature of an object into the range where it can be seen and presented to the eye. The sensation of hot and cold, however, comes from heating and cooling of the skin itself, like at the skin, such that Well, a nearby fire heats the skin, a cat on your lap heats the skin, the sun shining on your body heats the skin. Now, one way that heat is transferred is through what is called thermal radiation, which for most objects on the planet's surface equates to infrared due to their being at or near room temperature. This much is true. But the skin is not seeing any of this. It's not seeing an infrared. It's transferred heat. There's no way this woman's body from that distance and with what the ambient temperature is and the sun shining, that her presence or her body temperature being slightly elevated would do anything to nudge the needle at all in terms of how much heat is actually transferred to Matt's skin in that moment. But the problems don't end there, because even if it were possible for Matt to sense infrared radiation on his skin, as if his skin were one big retina and the infrared radiation were visible light, he still couldn't do what he's doing here. You see, this would be the equivalent of the early stages of the evolution of the eye. Before there even were eyes, there were pigment spots or eye spots, just a collection of light-sensitive cells on the surface of the animal. Some very primitive animals obviously still had these eye spots, and they've arisen independently many, many times. But these eye spots have been prone to evolving into something more, so that a small cavity forms around these light-sensitive cells. Why? Because that's the only way the animal could get any information about where this light source is coming from. If parts of the eye spot can be either shielded or exposed to light coming from a particular angle, that gives the animal some basic spatial information about where the light is coming from. Otherwise, if you just have a flat spot on the surface, the only thing the animal would know would be whether a light source is present or absent, and maybe to some extent how bright it is, but that's about it. There's no spatial information in that. What you have with a more fully developed eye, on the other hand, is a way to restrict and direct visual information that reaches the eye to fall in different parts of the retina. What a more fully formed eye can do that an eye spot cannot is form an image. The eye spot will indiscriminately receive all of the light falling on it from every angle, everywhere. And it's sort of like the equivalent of taking an image and hitting average blur in Photoshop. So what I'm getting at is that there's no version of what Matt's doing in this scene that makes even one iota of sense. Because even if his skin could quote-unquote see infrared light, it would be behaving like one giant eye spot covering his entire body. And so we're talking, average blur, zero details, nothing that would connect it to any individual heat source in this scene. Of course, unless it is concentrated or close to the skin, like you can feel the sun falling on some side of your body. That's fine, because that is that part of the body being differentially exposed to that light source. But again, that takes us back to perfectly normal thermosensation, which is, back to step one. It's not seeing, it's normal sensation of hot and cold. Now, I should add that there actually are animals that can form images via infrared light, most notably a family of snakes called pit vipers. But most importantly, the cells that detect the infrared radiation in this situation, they sit within these organs or these cavities, depressions, called pit organs, that are similar to a more primitive eye than ours, that acts like a pinhole camera. And you cannot have image formation without this kind of mechanism where you're sort of closing it up in front. This finally brings us back to the scene from episode 7 of Daredevil Born Again, which suffers from several problems, both basic stimulus problems, but some that also concern what happens in the brain, such as what kind of idea of what Heather actually looks like could Matt possibly get from touching her face with his fingers. There's also a big issue here with just simply missing information, as if Matt's able to not only quote-unquote see what's underneath his fingertips, but as if he would be able to get a sense of the entirety of these pictures by doing this, which I think we should be able to agree is impossible. And so just to kind of illustrate this, I spent about 10-15 minutes in Adobe After Effects piecing together a short little snapshot of what this might look like and how insanely limited that would be. And in this case, I'm not even taking into account the fact that, of course, he can't sense the color. I mean, there's way too much detail in this picture. But still, even with that, you can see that you can only touch what you're touching at any one time. So there's also the fact that the texture of the paint here in no way corresponds to any of the features of Heather's face. So feel free to add that layer of impossibility onto the situation. Let's also remind ourselves and get back to the fact that these are images. They are two-dimensional artistic renditions of the world. In this case, the sliver of the world named Heather Glenn, as she appears to a sighted artist. An artist who happens to also be a mass murderer, but still, he is a sighted person. And I cannot stress this enough. They are depicting something that Matt cannot see and has not been able to see for something like 3 decades at this point. None of his other senses form images in this way, or would be able to provide any of the information an artist would put down on a canvas. In fact, and I find this kind of interesting, the way Matt's ability to detect objects works is sort of like the inverse of how sight works. And this goes pretty much regardless of what we imagine this sense to be, although of course I obviously favor strict echolocation myself. But my point here is that to a sighted person, the experience of depth stems primarily from the brain working out the small differences between two-dimensional images with each presented to one eye. And a sense of depth then sort of emerges downstream of these two-dimensional images. Now, of course, there are ways to infer depth in other ways, and they start to dominate, like if you look at something very far away, where, of course, that detail in your two images, 1% at each eye, will be extremely similar, so your eyes cannot differentiate between that. There's also the fact that not everyone has stereo vision. For various reasons. One of the ways that depth can be inferred is maybe if you have one object that's closer to you that is partially obscuring another object. And there's also that concept of optical flow that I mentioned earlier, that as we are moving through the environment, some objects appear to sort of pass us on the sides, or they become larger or more distant if we're backing away. So that also gives you a good sense of depth. In fact, and very pertinent to this scene, some of these tricks are also what artists use to render something three-dimensional into dimensions. So you use maybe shading to convey the nose protruding from the face. Yeah, you're basically painting a two-dimensional projection of three-dimensional space, and then you leave the rest of it to the viewer's brains to kind of fill in the gaps and to understand what this space looks like. This two-dimensional image projection is something that, of course, we're very used to as those of us who are sighted in the world, to see these two-dimensional projections. Now, Matt's view of the world is entirely three-dimensional and devoid of all two-dimensional surface information. Even though, of course, to some extent, the texture and material of an object would be something that he could discern, and we know that from the available research on human echolocation. But whereas we can construct a three-dimensional space from two-dimensional images presented to both eyes, he cannot recreate that missing two-dimensional information. His sense of the objects around him stems from echo information, and this is really regardless of what we imagine the radar sense to be, so that even if you prefer the idea that it's electromagnetic waves, it would be the same thing. It's echo information, where the signal contains only spatial information. So it carries within it, this signal carries within it some location in three-dimensional space. Now, mind you, of course, the brain has to do some processing to make sense of all of this, but that's true for all of the senses, really. But yeah, this actually does make sense. This builds on something real that real people are able to do. And of course, now I'm talking about echolocation using sound, not radar vision strictly, because that is a sense that does not exist anywhere in nature. But I've also made the case that this conundrum is what makes Matt Murdock's very particular brand of blindness so difficult to make sense of for so many people. And one problem with severe but less than total vision loss in the real world is that you have the situation that with the diminishing quality of the images presented to the eyes in terms of acuity, contrast, there can be distortions in these images presented. What comes with that is the ability to make reliable spatial judgments about the visual world diminishes as well. And it also may be difficult to tell real objects from shadows and so on. So these things in the real world tend to go together. And because of this, I think there tends to be a tendency to forget how sort of two-dimensionally blind Matt really is, because his spatial abilities have been completely decoupled from the other things we typically use our sense of sight for, and that he can't detect at all. And this is exactly why he can behave as if he's fully sighted in one scenario, but in another scenario be at no greater advantage than any other totally blind person would be, because it all depends on the specific demands of the situation. And because our sense of touch can also only reveal 3D relationships on a larger scale if we're talking about sort of touching a whole object or like a discernible feature of an object, or on a smaller, more sort of microscopic scale if we're talking about texture and sort of material properties of an object. There's also no reason to assume that Matt would get any kind of sight-like image of Heather simply from touching her face. And I should add that this is the kind of scene that makes many blind viewers groan. I believe there's even an expression for it called gratuitous face touching. And that's not to say that no blind person would ever do what Matt's doing in this scene, especially because this is an intimate scene between, it's an intimate moment between lovers. But there's just simply no way that Matt gets any information from doing this that would be similar in experience to touching a sighted person's paint job or artwork. Because there's no one-to-one translation between the senses here. And so to finally sum up why this scene doesn't work, there's one, insufficient information of any kind. He's very briefly touching the painting and can only sense what he's touching at any one time, which is very little. Two, touching the paint just reveals the texture of the paint. An artist has put down a sighted person's view of Heather's face using strokes of paint that leave behind a textured surface that in no way corresponds to Heather's appearance in either 2 or 3 dimensions. And 3, Matt's mental idea what Heather looks like from touching her face would be very difficult to translate into a sighted person's experience. And on that final note, there's a lot of interesting things we could get into in terms of what and how much a previously sighted person would remember of seeing after decades of blindness, and looking at some real world examples that seems to actually vary a great deal from person to person. But that's perhaps a topic for another video or a blog post perhaps. And that takes me to the end of this video. Please do like and subscribe, and if you found this video the least bit helpful, or you feel like there are places where it needs to be shared, please do. And this was actually a really good episode, aside from this this little ball drop, and I'm looking forward to seeing where they go next. I hope we don't see more of this, because it's quite concerning. I didn't think I'd have to worry about stuff like this, especially after the first 6 episodes. But yeah, at least it gave me something to talk about for this video. So hope you've enjoyed it, and check out the links to the associated post in the description. Bye.